She held a gun to the mountain man in her barn, until the storm made him her only hope. The Wyoming wilderness was an unforgiving beast clawing at Eleanor Vance's small ranch with a wind that screamed of loneliness, desperation, and a chilling final certainty. Ellie wrestled with the splintered barn door, her knuckles raw against the rough wood. Each swing of the hammer was a testament to her fierce independence. This ranch, this life, was all she had left of him, his dream, now her solitary burden. She'd be damned if she let a little blow tear it all down. With one final desperate shove, she slammed the bolt home. The barn was sealed. Safe. But as she turned, a flicker of movement in the deepest corner of the hayloft stole the air from her lungs. It wasn't one of her animals. A horrifying truth struck her like a bullet. The monster she was fighting to keep out was already inside. What would you do? Confront the shadow with the rifle you keep by the door, or slip away into the storm and take your chances? Let me know your survival plan in the comments below. The wind screamed. It was a hollow sound born in the distant snow-dusted peaks and funneled through the valley until it clawed at Eleanor Vance's small ranch with the fury of a starving animal. The sky was a bruised, unforgiving gray pressing down on the land, smothering the light. Around her, the world was skeletal. The stark black fingers of cottonwood trees, the pale dead grass crushed flat against the frozen earth. This was a place that did not welcome life. It endured it. And so did she. Ellie's knuckles were raw, the skin split and bleeding where they scraped against the rough-hewn plank. Every muscle in her back and shoulders burned with a cold, insistent fire. She threw her entire weight against the protesting barn door, a frantic battle against the storm's first violent shove. No, she grunted the word, a plume of white snatched from her lips by the gale. You don't get this place. This wasn't just a barn. It was a cathedral of memory. Thomas's ghost was in every nail he had driven, every beam he had set. His laughter was a faint echo in the scent of dry hay and leather. This ranch was his dream, and now it was her solitary burden, her sacred promise. She'd be damned if she let a little blow tear it all down. With a final desperate heave, the bolt slid home. The heavy bar slammed into its iron cradle with a sound of profound finality. Thunk. Silence. The roar of the wind seemed to momentarily recede, held at bay by the wood and her will. She leaned against the door, her chest heaving a wave of relief so potent it was dizzying. Safe. The animals were safe. She was safe. But the silence that followed was wrong. It wasn't empty. It was watchful. A rustle in the hayloft above. Not a rat, too heavy. Not a calf, too still. Her blood ran cold, a frozen river in her veins. Every instinct honed by 2 years of solitude in this untamed land screamed. The rifle. She had left Thomas's old Winchester leaning right by the entrance. Her hand closed around the cold, familiar stock. The weight of it was a comfort, a piece of him. A piece of the life that was gone. She moved without a sound, a shadow gliding across the dusty floor. The air was thick with the scent of fear, hers and something else. Something wild. She raised the rifle, the heavy barrel trembling slightly in her grasp, and began to climb the ladder to the loft. One rung, then another. The world narrowed to the square of darkness above. He was a shape, first a hulking silhouette against the gloom. A man, large, broad-shouldered, and utterly still tucked into the far corner like a predator in its den. His face was a mask of tangled beard and shadow, but his eyes, they caught the faint light glinting with a weary, feral intelligence. He wasn't moving. He was just watching her. The air crackled. The hammer of the Winchester clicked back a sound that was deafening in the sudden stillness. "Don't move," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing she barely recognized. It tried for authority, but trembled with terror. The shape didn't flinch. It simply breathed a slow, deep inhale. On your feet, she commanded, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. Slowly, where I can see your hands. The man rose, unfolding from the hay with a weary groan. He was taller than she'd thought, his frame filling the cramped space. His hands were open empty. He wore the rough skins of a man who had long ago turned his back on towns, on people. A mountain man. A ghost. "What do you want here?" she asked the barrel of the gun, unwavering. His voice, when it came, was the sound of rocks grinding together. A single word, rough and torn from a throat unused to speaking. Shelter. The word hung between them, both a simple truth and an impossible request. She couldn't shoot a man for wanting to live, but she couldn't trust him. Trust was a luxury she had buried with her husband. "There's a rope." By the post, she set her mind racing. "Tie your own hands. Do it now, or I swear to God the storm won't be your problem anymore." For a long moment he just stared at her, and she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not anger. Not fear. Something that looked terribly like understanding. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod and turned to the rope. As he secured his own bonds, the full fury of the blizzard finally broke upon them. The barn groaned, the wood shrieking under an impossible weight. Snow and wind hammered against the walls, no longer asking for entry, but demanding it. They were trapped, the two of them, a prisoner and his warden locked in a wooden box at the mercy of God's own rage. Then came a sound that made both of them freeze. A deep, groaning crack from directly overhead. Splinters rained down, dusting their shoulders. The main crossbeam, the very spine of the barn, was beginning to give way. The sound was the world breaking. A deep, guttural crack that tore through the blizzard's scream. Dust and bits of ancient hay rained down from the hayloft, dusting the shoulders of the bound man and catching in Ellie's eyelashes. Below, the cattle panicked, their lowing turning to bellows of terror as they strained against their stalls. The very air, thick with cold, now vibrated with a new and immediate fear. The beam, the great central beam that held the weight of a generation of snows. It had surrendered. Ellie's gaze shot from the splintered wood overhead to the terrified animals, then to the man tied to the post. The rifle in her hands suddenly felt absurd, useless. You can't shoot a blizzard. You can't put a bullet through a collapsing roof. Her mind raced a frantic stampede of impossible choices. Let him loose, a stranger, a wild man with eyes that held no fear of her gun. Or watch as the roof came down, crushing the herd, crushing the last living piece of Thomas's soul, crushing her along with it. The barn groaned again, a long, agonizing death rattle. The west wall shuddered, taking the full force of a gust that felt like the fist of God. There was no choice, only a prayer and a gamble. She moved toward him, the rifle still leveled, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I'm going to cut you loose," she said, her voice sharp, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "You will help me save this barn. You will do exactly as I say. You try anything." She let the barrel of the gun drift an inch higher until it was aimed squarely at his chest. "And this storm will be the last thing you ever feel." He didn't answer. He simply watched her with those unnerving, assessing eyes. She pulled a small knife from her belt, never taking the rifle off him, and sawed through the thick rope. It fell away. He didn't lunge. He didn't run. He simply stood, rubbing the raw red welts on his wrists. For a moment he looked at his own hands as if they were foreign objects. Then his gaze snapped to the splintered beam, his eyes narrowed in calculation. The weary ghost was gone, replaced by a man of sharp, sudden purpose. The sledgehammer, he growled, his voice a low command. "And all the rope you have." She hesitated for a barest second, bristling at his tone, then ran to get them. There was no time for pride. They worked in a desperate, frantic silence, their breaths mingling in the freezing air, visible in the swaying lantern light. He moved with an economy of motion. She had never seen a brute strength tempered by a clear, practical mind. He showed her how to loop the ropes around the sagging beam, how to use the weight of the hay bales as a counterweight. He was the anchor. She was the motion, a blur of fetching and securing as he directed their frantic ballet. Slowly, the groaning subsided. The beam was braced. It was an ugly, desperate fix, but it was holding. It wouldn't be enough. The west wall, he panted, his voice raw. It's taking too much wind. It'll be the next to go. As if summoned, a gust of impossible force slammed into the barn. The west wall bowed inwards, the wood screaming in protest. A stall near the wall splintered, collapsing on itself, and one of the heifers let out a high-pitched cry of pain, its leg pinned beneath a shattered plank. Ellie cried out, moving toward the animal. Her leg! It's trapped! Stay back! Jake yelled, grabbing her arm, his grip like iron. She's spooked. She'll crush you. He handed her the end of a long rope. Loop this around that front post. Pull it taut when I tell you. I'm going to try and lever the plank. To do it, she had to put the rifle down. The thought was a jolt of pure fear. She looked at his back, at the broad, powerful shoulders, at the wild tangle of his hair. She was disarming herself. For him. For a cow. She laid the Winchester carefully on a bale of hay. He moved toward the trapped animal, not with aggression, but with a strange, quiet calm. He didn't shout. He began to speak to it, a low, rumbling murmur that was almost a chant. The heifer's panicked eyes remained wide, but the frantic thrashing of its head began to slow. He slid a long, sturdy plank under the wreckage, positioning it as a lever. Now he grunted. Pull. She pulled with all her might, the rope biting into her hands, providing the tension he needed. He put his shoulder into the lever, his muscles straining, the veins in his neck standing out. The heavy plank lifted just enough. The heifer scrambled free, stumbling but alive. He collapsed back, breathing heavily, the immediate crisis averted. They stood there for a long moment, the only sound the howl of the wind and their own ragged gasps for air. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. They had done it. They had faced the storm's fury. And for now, they had won. Ellie leaned against a post, her legs shaking. She looked at him. Really looked at him. Not as an intruder, not as a vagrant or a monster from the mountains. She saw the sweat on his brow, the intelligence in his eyes, the raw bleeding scrapes on his own hands. She saw a man who had, without a second thought, worked to save her home. To save Thomas's dream. He met her gaze from across the lantern-lit space. The chasm of fear and mistrust that had separated them was gone, replaced by something else. Something quiet and intense and terrifyingly new. The question was no longer, is he a threat? It was, who is he? The roar of the storm became a distant, rhythmic thing, the drumming of a war that was happening somewhere else. Inside the fragile shelter of the barn, a new kind of silence had fallen. It was not the tense, watchful quiet of before, but a heavy shared stillness forged in the crucible of their shared fight. The air was cold, but the frantic chill of fear had been replaced by the dull ache of profound exhaustion. Ellie watched him. He had slumped against the wall near the now calm heifer, his massive shoulders bowed, his head in his hands. The lantern light carved deep shadows into the lines of his face, making him look ancient, a man carved from grief and granite. She saw the raw, angry red of the rope burns on his wrists, a stark reminder of the gun she had laid aside. The gun that now seemed like a relic from a different lifetime. She moved before she had truly decided, to her body acting on an instinct older than fear. She fetched the small wooden box from a shelf near the entrance, her meager medical kit. It held little more than salves, clean linen, and a bottle of carbolic acid. She knelt in front of him. He flinched his head, snapping up the wild look, returning to his eyes for a heartbeat. "Stay still," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "They'll fester." He watched her, his jaw tight as she uncorked the bottle and dampened a strip of linen. He did not pull away as she gently, methodically cleaned the grit from the broken skin. His hands, which had braced falling timbers and calmed panicked beasts, were steady under her touch. They were calloused and scarred from a hard life, yet there was a structure to them, a length to the fingers that felt wrong for a man of the mountains. It was the way he had calmed the cow, the quiet confidence in his voice, the precise way he had assessed the physics of the collapsing beam. "You're no drifter," she stated the words, leaving her before she could stop them. It wasn't a question. He was silent for a long time, watching her wrap the clean linen around his first wrist. The only sounds were the lowing of the cattle and the storm's muffled howl. She thought he wouldn't answer. "I was a doctor once," he finally said, his voice so low it was almost lost in the wind. The words stopped her cold. She looked up from his hands to his face, her own breath caught in her throat. A field surgeon, he continued, his gaze lost in the flickering flame of the lantern. "In the war. Saw things no man should see. After it was all over, I thought I could still do some good. Went to a mining camp up in the Colorados. Full of hope. Full of families." He fell silent again, and the darkness in his eyes seemed to swallow the light. Then the fever came. Diphtheria. It moved through the camp like a phantom, choking the life out of the children first. He took a ragged breath. "I did everything I knew. I boiled water, I lanced throats, I prayed to a God I'd stopped believing in years before. But it wasn't enough. My knowledge was a whisper against a hurricane." He finally looked at her, and she saw the ghost that haunted him, the failure that had driven him into the wild. "I watched them die," he whispered, his voice cracking with a pain so raw it was a physical thing. "I held their hands. I told their mothers I was doing all I could, and I was. And it was nothing. They started calling me the butcher, the man who brought the city sickness with him. In the end, I couldn't bear the sight of my own useless hands. So I walked away. From all of it." Ellie stared at him, at this broken, brilliant man. The fear she'd felt, the anger, the suspicion, it all dissolved, washed away by a wave of crushing, heartbreaking empathy. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had tried to heal the world and had been broken by it. A single hot tear escaped her eye and traced a cold path down her cheek. "Thomas," she said, her own voice a ghost. "My husband." Jake's gaze met hers, his own pain momentarily forgotten in the face of hers. "He was mending a fence last spring," she continued the story, tumbling out a confession to a fellow survivor. "A piece of old barbed wire. It was a small cut. Nothing. But it got angry. The red spread up his arm. The fever started. And it wouldn't break. We were too far from town. There was no doctor. No one." Her voice faltered. She looked at the man before her, at the hands she was tending, hands that knew how to fight fevers, how to stop the spread of poison. The terrible, beautiful irony of it settled over her, a weight heavier than the snow on the roof. "He died," she whispered the words of final surrender to her grief. "He died right in our bed, burning up while I watched. Helpless. He died for want of a man like you." The storm raged outside, a symphony of chaos. But inside the barn, a profound and terrible quiet had descended. They were no longer a captor and her prisoner. They were two ghosts adrift in the same storm, suddenly irrevocably stranded on the same small island of pain. The confessions lay between them in the frigid air, as real and as fragile as the frost feathering the barn's single window. A story of failure for a story of loss. A wound for a scar. The storm's howling was no longer a threat, but a lament, a wild chorus for their shared silent grief. They were two solitary ships who, in a sea of blinding snow, had found the wreckage of the other. It was Ellie who moved, first propelled by a need that was suddenly deeper than survival. It was the need for comfort. "We need a fire," she announced, her voice quiet but firm in the vast, cold space. "And coffee, if we're to see the dawn." It was an offering, a truce not of necessity but of humanity. Jake looked up, his eyes clouded with the ghosts of his past, but he saw the sincerity in hers. He gave a slow, weary nod. Their earlier frantic teamwork was replaced by a slow, deliberate grace. He cleared a space in the center of the dirt floor, away from the hay and the wood building, a small, safe ring of stones, with the methodical precision of a man who understood fire's fickle nature. She brought the kindling, a small sack of coffee beans, and the old tin pot she and Thomas had used on camping trips. Their hands brushed as she passed him the wood. A jolt, quick and surprising, passed between them. Neither acknowledged it, but the air shifted again, charged with a new, unspoken current. He coaxed a flame to life, and as it grew from a timid flicker to a steady, confident glow, it pushed back the oppressive shadows, creating a small golden bubble of warmth and light. It was a defiant island in the heart of the storm. The rich, bitter scent of brewing coffee soon filled the barn, a smell of mornings of normalcy, of a life she thought had vanished forever. She handed him a steaming tin cup. He took it without a word, his large scarred hands wrapping around it as if to steal its warmth. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, the silence returning, but this time it was a comfortable breathing thing. "Tell me," she said softly, her gaze on the dancing flames, "about being a doctor. What was it like before—" He stared into his cup for a long time. It was quiet work, mostly. He murmured the words strange and rusted. Despite the chaos of the war, you learn that most of healing isn't about knives and saws. It's about listening, about watching. People, they just want to know someone is seeing their pain. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the fire. They want to know they're not alone in it. The words landed resonating with the profound loneliness she had carried for 2 years. He nodded toward the rough-sawn walls of the barn. This was a good dream. His and yours. A sad, genuine smile touched Ellie's lips for the first time. Thomas loved the sky out here. He said it was the only thing big enough to hold a man's ambitions. She took a sip of the hot black coffee, the bitterness a welcome shock. We were going to raise horses, the finest in Wyoming. He had it all planned out. "It's good land," Jake said, his voice a low rumble. "It holds its promises." As they spoke, sharing these small broken pieces of their pasts, the storm seemed to fade into a dull, distant roar. The barn, once a prison of fear, became a sanctuary. The man who had been a monster became simply Jake, a man who understood the language of loss. A violent shiver racked her body, a sudden reminder of the relentless cold seeping through her coat. Before she could react, Jake was on his feet. He moved to where she'd laid her saddle and retrieved the thick wool horse blanket strapped to it. He walked back, and with a hesitation that was almost tender, he gently draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it was substantial, and it smelled of leather horse and the clean, cold air of the mountains. Of him. His knuckles brushed her neck a touch, as light as a moth's wing, and the shiver that went through her this time had nothing to do with the cold. She looked up at him, her heart giving a slow, heavy thump. He stood over her, a guardian in the firelight, his expression unreadable, but for the deep, aching sadness in his eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. He just nodded and returned to his spot by the fire. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, the rough wool a profound comfort, and in that moment a truth bloomed in her heart, a truth so stunning and illogical it took her breath away. Here, trapped in a blizzard with a strange, broken man who had invaded her home, she felt safer than she had at any moment since Thomas died. The wind could howl. The roof could groan. But the terror was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, steady warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The storm she had been fighting wasn't just outside the barn walls. It had been inside her, too. And somehow, impossibly, this stranger had just brought her shelter. The hours before dawn were a hollow, breathless space, a pause between the world that was and the world that would be. The fire had dwindled to a bed of winking orange embers, casting a soft, warm glow that did little to combat the bone-deep cold, but held the darkness at bay. The storm had not broken, but its fury had eased, its voice lowering from a furious scream to a deep, mournful howl. It was the sound of a great beast exhausted from its own rage. Ellie was awake. She had been for some time wrapped in the heavy wool blanket watching the stranger sleep. In repose, with the firelight softening the hard lines of his face, the feral wildness was gone. She saw only a man burdened by a profound weariness, his brow furrowed even in sleep, as if his ghosts gave him no rest. She saw the healer in the gentle curve of his mouth, the soldier in the rigid set of his jaw. She saw the man who had walked out of the mountains and the man who had been driven into them. A strange, protective feeling stirred in her chest. It was unsettling. It was dangerous. It felt terrifyingly like hope. As the first hint of a weak, watery light began to seep through the cracks in the barn walls, the sound of the wind changed again. It was lessening, dying. The crisis was passing, and with its passing a new and sharper anxiety took its place. The storm had been their cage, but it had also been their context, the reason for their fragile alliance. When it was gone, what would they be, a homesteader and a drifter? A woman and a stranger she had tied up at gunpoint. Jake stirred his eyes opening with the slow, cautious awareness of a man who never felt truly safe. He looked at the low embers, then at the pale light filtering through the walls. He looked at her, and the intimacy of the firelit night was suddenly gone, replaced by a cautious, awkward distance. The dawn was coming, and with it the rules of the world. Without a word, as if by some unspoken agreement, they both rose and began to tend to the animals. Their movements were quiet, synchronized. He forked fresh hay into the stalls while she broke the thin layer of ice in the water troughs. There was an easy rhythm to their work, a shared purpose that needed no direction. For a fleeting, painful moment, it felt natural. It felt like the mornings she had shared with Thomas. The thought was a splinter of glass in her heart, and she pushed it away. The chores were done too quickly. The silence that fell was louder than the storm had ever been. There were no more tasks to hide behind, no more crises to unite them. There was only the cold, gray morning and the unspoken question hanging in the air between them. What now? He walked to the door, his boots scuffing softly in the dirt. He did not look at her. He was a man reverting to his nature, a creature of solitude retreating to the wild. He was choosing his cold, lonely mountain again. He was choosing his prison. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs. Say something. Anything. Don't just let him walk away. Not back to that. Not after this. He reached the door, and his hand rested on the heavy wooden bar they had braced together. He stood there for a long moment, his back to her, a solitary, powerful silhouette against the growing light. Then he turned his face, a mask of grim resolve, but his eyes held a quiet, painful gratitude. It was a goodbye, a final silent acknowledgement of the night they had survived. He was about to lift the bar. He was about to walk out of her life and back into his own lonely hell. The roof, she said the word rushing out, thin and desperate in the cold air. He froze, his hand still on the bar. That beam is braced, not fixed. She continued, finding her strength, her voice growing steadier. And the west wall, it won't survive another storm like this. It all needs to be rebuilt. She took a breath, her gaze locked on his, a final terrifying gamble. A man could work for his keep, she said, her voice dropping each word, a carefully laid stone across a rushing river. For a hot breakfast at least. And a real bed. The ground is cold. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a demand. It was an offer. A fragile bridge built of practicality and a desperate unspoken hope extended into the wilderness of their shared future. She had opened the door to her world just a crack, and now she waited her entire life, seeming to hang on the question of whether he would dare to step through it. His hand rested on the heavy bar, a bridge between the world he knew of solitude, of punishing cold, of a silent one-man grief, and the world she was offering. A world of warmth, of hot coffee, of a future that required more than just survival. Ellie held her breath, the fragile hope in her chest so fierce it was a physical pain. The entire world seemed to pause, waiting on the decision of this one broken man. He did not speak. His fingers slowly uncurled, letting go of the wood. His hand dropped to his side. He turned fully to face her, and in the pale, clean light of the dawn, she saw the war in his eyes finally come to an end. It was a surrender, not to her, but to a possibility he had long ago denied himself. He gave a single slow nod. The walk from the barn to the house was the longest journey of her life. The world was newborn, washed clean, and swaddled in a thick, pristine blanket of white. The sun, a brilliant, distant diamond, cast long blue shadows that stretched like ghosts across the snow. Their boots were the only things to mar the perfect surface, two sets of footprints side by side, forging a new path from the wreckage of the past to the warmth of a waiting door. Her small cabin, which had always felt empty and hollow, suddenly seemed impossibly full with his presence. He filled the space, his broad shoulders seeming to brush the low ceiling, his quietness a living entity by the hearth. He sat at her small kitchen table, Thomas's table, and looked out the window at the endless white mountain momentarily captured between four walls. Ellie moved with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She stoked the stove, the familiar clatter of iron a comforting sound. Soon, the scent of sizzling bacon and fresh, strong coffee filled the small room. A smell so potently domestic, so full of life, it almost brought her to tears. It was the smell of a home, not just a house. She placed a heavy plate of bacon and eggs in front of him. He looked down at it, then back up at her, a look of profound, bewildered gratitude in his eyes. "I only have 10 cups," she said, her voice a little shaky. "They hold coffee, same as any other, ma'am." He replied, his voice a low, gentle rumble. They ate in a comfortable silence, the simple act of sharing a meal a ritual more intimate than any words. The fear was gone. The desperation was gone. All that remained was a man and a woman, two survivors sitting at a table, while the sun climbed higher in the vast Wyoming sky. When they were done, they stood on the small porch, the air so cold and clean, it was like drinking from a mountain spring. They looked out at the barn. The damage was severe. The west wall was a ruin. The roof sagged like the back of a tired old beast. A lesser woman would have seen only loss. A lesser woman would have wept. Ellie saw only the work that needed to be done. "I suppose I'll have to start by salvaging what timber I can," she said, thinking aloud. Jake stood beside her, his gaze steady and practical. "We'll need to clear the snow from what's left of the roof first," he said. "Then we can see how bad that beam really is. The west wall will have to be rebuilt from the foundation up." The word settled into her heart, not with a jolt, but with the quiet, steady click of a key, turning in a long rusted lock. She looked at him, at his strong profile against the brilliant blue sky. The hunted look was gone from his eyes. In its place was a quiet resolve. He was no longer just surviving. He was planning. He was building. She nodded. "All right, doctor," she said the word, slipping out soft and a little teasing. "Where do we begin?" A smile, the first she had ever seen, touched the corners of his mouth. It was a small, rusty thing, but it transformed his face, chasing away the last of the shadows. "I think," he said, his eyes twinkling with a long-lost light, "we begin with an axe." And so they began. Not with the frantic, desperate energy of the night, but with the slow, steady rhythm of rebuilding. He, with his sleeves rolled up, swung the axe, the clean, sharp thwack of steel on wood, echoing in the silent sun-drenched valley. She, with her hammer, began prying loose the good planks from the ruined her movements filled with a grim, joyful purpose. They worked together under the wide-open sky. The silence between them was no longer empty or awkward. It was full of the sounds of their labor, of shared purpose, of the unspoken promise of more days like this one. She paused for a moment, leaning against a post, and watched him work. The sun was warm on her back. The air was clean in her lungs. And for the first time in 2 long, lonely years, Ellie Vance did not feel like a widow. She felt like a woman who was against all odds finally building a home. A quiet dawn, a shared breakfast, and the slow, steady work of rebuilding. Sometimes, the greatest adventures aren't about the battles we fight, but about the choice to build something new from the wreckage. Do you believe a shared crisis can truly heal a broken soul? If this story of survival and second chances resonated with you, hit that like button to let us know. And tell us in the comments below, what does a happy ending in the Wild West really look like to you? Thank you for riding with us. Subscribe and ring the bell because there are always more stories waiting to be told just over the next sunrise.